I worked as the post sinologist. Due to the communications at the time, I was able to read every communication going out of the comm center between Beijing and Ottawa and advise the other section heads on what was going on, pick up on things that at the time, the reason that they hired an outsider like me was lack of expertise in mainland Chinese affairs in our diplomatic cohort, more or less where it is. I don't think we ever got China right, but we're getting it in particularly badly wrong since the past, whatever, decade since Xi Jinping came into power. Canada as having the highest degree of elite capture of all the Western industrialized nations. So, that is a cause for concern. We want our policymakers to be making policy in the interests of Canada and not convinced through a subtle and sophisticated process that plays on their naivety and grave to be acting consciously or unconsciously as agents for foreign power.
Dr. Charles Burton, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. We've communicated for the past couple of years, but I've been following your work for a number of years. And for those that don't know you, is it possible for you to just briefly explain your long-standing experience in Chinese affairs and then within Canada's diplomatic community for those that don't know?
Well, I got an interest in this way back when I was in high school. There was a bookstore between my high school and my home on the long walk home down Rideau Street in Ottawa called Progressive Books that stocked nothing but publications from the People's Republic of China in an assortment of languages. But for my interest, English, although one could have got most of the stuff in Esperanto too. And so I started, these books were very reasonably priced. And so I started to read, Chinese political stuff, the Peking Review and the other publications of the day, the magazine China Reconstructs and so on. And then I got to know the men working in the bookstore who were not in that good health, actually, looked a bit tubercular to me. And they told me that they were members of the Canadian Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, and asked me if I would be interested in joining them and establishing a communist cell in my high school, Lisgar Collegiate in Ottawa. But I told them that I was a bit busy singing in my church choir and other pressing activities. I was the president of the Latin club of my school and regrettably would be unable to foment revolution in Ottawa at that time. But I maintained the interest and eventually I studied Chinese philosophy at the U of T and then went to Cambridge, England, University of Cambridge, where I learned Chinese. And then I transferred over to Fudan University in Shanghai on the Canada-China Student Exchange Program, which was established at the time of diplomatic relations and allowed 10 students from each country to study in the other. So I went to Fudan University in 1978, when really there were so few foreigners in China. You could get all the Canadians in China around the Canadian Embassy swimming pool on Canada Day because there were only the 10 students and some diplomats, no business people. And for an entire year, I was the only Canadian resident in the city of Shanghai registered with the embassy. So, it was a whole different time. There were only 13 foreign students at Fudan University in those days. So I studied the history of ancient Chinese thought, came back from China and got a job working in the communication security establishment in Ottawa. A bit surprising as to how I got the security clearance for that, as I had, disappeared into communist China for almost 4 years, but I did. And then as soon as I got to the CSE on Heron Road at that time, they informed me that they didn't do China and I would go immediately on Russian language training, which I did, which was not a good experience. Many people listening may know Russian, but I found the grammar just horrendous, and ended up, working in that job, going to Soviet Russia every morning. Came home to my apartment in Ottawa feeling like I should smoke 60 cigarettes and drink a quart of vodka, because it was such a depressing job, monitoring their military, which was not in good condition at the time. Then I decided to transfer and do a doctorate at the University of Toronto on Chinese affairs, which I did. And I was at Princeton University. I did a postdoc at the University of Alberta. Got a job at Brock University, and then more or less immediately on my beginning at Brock, I was invited to be seconded to work in the Canadian Embassy in Beijing in 1991. I had my first posting there. I worked as the post sinologist. Due to the communications at the time, I was able to read every communication going out of the comm center between Beijing and Ottawa, and advise the other section heads on what was going on, pick up on things that at the time, the reason that they hired an outsider like me was lack of expertise in mainland Chinese affairs in our diplomatic cohort due to, we just didn't have those people. Then I went back into the academy for 4 or so years, and then returned to the embassy and working in the political section on my second posting. Since then, I've been doing pretty much solid Canada-China relations over all those years, and now I have left Brock University simply because there's just too much demand for security consulting on the part of governments throughout the world, particularly Eastern Europe. Essentially, we have a situation where we have a lot of people who have very strong skills in countering the Russian threat, but many countries are finding that China poses a much more emerging threat, much better funded, quite a sophisticated strategy. And we just can't, it's just difficult to apply those Russia skills to the China challenge. They're operating under a different model, and there just aren't enough people available who have the language skills, knowledge of Chinese Communist Party domestic and foreign doctrine, and to have the ability to transfer that into language and reports that governments can absorb. So there aren't too many people like me doing this kind of work. So I'm in quite a lot of demand, which is nice on one hand, but also a bit a lot of pressure there on the other to deliver good work and try and help to meet the challenge of China's increasingly malign activities in countries around the world. But I'm after all these years, I'm sort of too old to retrain to another venue of the human experience. So I'm stuck with this really quite dismal work of explaining to governments and what threat China poses to them, and making recommendations for what they might do about it. And I think, as we'll get in this conversation, there's still a lot of reluctance to act. That it requires some bureaucratic will to reorient resources, and I think remaining skepticism about how real this threat is to nations. In other words, people who have a sort of attitude of naive goodwill really can't believe that the Chinese regime has such coordinated, staged, and malign plans to achieve a global hegemony and assume a status as the superpower of the world. So, you're working against a lot of elements, and not to speak of what you'll be talking about today, which is elite capture, which causes people on the ground to make recommendations to their government to better counter this threat, and then find that they're shelved at the top level, and China is able to continue with its agenda more or less unhindered. So, that's really where I'm at. I wish there were more people like me, and I wish there was some way to develop successors. But today, what bright young student would want to spend 4 years in the People's Republic of China developing those skills? And aside from which, these days the Chinese Communist regime keeps any foreigners who come to learn there more or less away from the mainstream society by putting them into separated ghettos and monitoring their activities much more strictly than was possible when I was among the small group of foreigners in China in those years. So it is. I guess I should try and make a call for governments to allocate more resources to training people. It's not a problem that can be solved in a short time frame, but it's certainly one which we should be looking at for the long term.
A number of good points, and hopefully you have time to pull them all out. I'm wondering, just to start, you've been lived and tracked and studied China for a number of years. At what point did you notice a shift in Chinese Communist Party strategy, and could you describe what that model shifted to? What is that model that you're looking at? How do you look at the Chinese Communist Party today?
Well, I think that the traditional sort of Marxist doctrine, their analysis of history, is that in the past China was the greatest power and strongest civilization on the planet, and all other nations were subordinate to China. So you had the emperor was the only legitimate political authority in the world. He was the son of heaven and had a connection with the forces of the universe that made him the only, what one might say, legitimate political force. And other nations would provide tribute to the emperor. So China would send officials to the extremes of the empire, and then beyond that, where the people were considered too barbarian to be ruled directly from the Chinese capital, those tribal chiefs or whatever, including the Dutch, that the Chinese identified as being the Europeans. They had red hair and smelled of cheese, should send tribute to the emperor to show that they acknowledge the superiority of Chinese political domination, and if they, sending the tribute, the Chinese would not directly conquer them. So that was the traditional view. And then the historiography of it goes, in the 1840 Opium War, China, at a weak stage in the dynastic cycle of 24 rise and falls of Chinese dynasties, was humiliated by the British. And that was when things started to go badly wrong with the 1842 Treaty of Nanking that conceded the island of Hong Kong to the British, and subsequent, what the Chinese regard as unfair treaties, whereby other nations were able to hive off sections of China as colonies and areas of control like Shanghai and Tianjin, Wuhan, and so on. And then, of course, the other foreign incursions, which meant that foreigners were not subject to Chinese law, and foreign armies were able to make the Chinese submit. The last big one probably being the Boxer Rebellion suppression in 1900. So this kind of history is writ very large for the Chinese communists. So the purpose of the regime is to restore China's greatness, what they call the Chinese dream, and establish what Xi Jinping in his 2017 address to the Chinese Communist Party Congress defines as the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is really about a reordering of, in what he refers to as a new type international relations, but a debasement of the existing liberal democratic post-war institutions like the UN and the WTO, and a replacement with a Chinese-dominated globe, with the economy being coordinated by the Belt and Road Initiative, massive infrastructure project which reorients all of global economy towards China. It's an ambition based on an interpretation of history that suggests that China was humiliated by the West, that China is in fact the greatest civilization, that the Chinese Communist Party is the modern expression of the greatness of the Chinese civilization of the past, and that under Xi Jinping things will be put to right. The foreigners will be restored to their subordinate status, and civilization will radiate from the Chinese capital under the wise leadership of a charismatic strongman leader who would not only, as he does now, dominate China, but would be someone that all the other nations of the world would look up to. So you have that doctrine, and when that came into force after Mr. Xi became the party general secretary and the Central Military Commission head in 2018, then this marked a fundamental shift in China's in our understanding of China, or at least it should have. Prior to that, under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, China held out the promise that it would become in compliant with the international rules-based order, that China would eventually move towards the kind of governance that is described in the UN covenants like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which they actually signed in 1998, although they never ratified it. And so we were given the impression that if we were patient, that China would eventually, what they described as get on the rails and become a responsible stakeholder in the global community and serve to the benefit. When Xi came in, one of the earlier things that he did was issue a document banning even discourse on Western political categories. So he objects to constitutionalism. In other words, the idea that constitutions should be, the penultimate law. He believes that China should be ruled by the judgment of virtuous men, or discussion of electoral democracy, separation of powers between the legislature, judiciary, and executive, and all of these freedom of expression, the notion that people are citizenships with entitlements to human rights. Under Xi, discussion of this, either in the media or in universities, was simply became verboten. And so we then at that time realized that, any notion that China under Xi Jinping's regime was going to collaborate with global norms and engage in honest, fair, and reciprocal diplomatic and trade relations with the West was over. And therefore, we really have to regard China as not a potential, element that we can cooperate with or compete with on a level playing field, but recognize that the regime's intention towards us is to bring us into submission through whatever means the regime has at its disposal. And so I think I think that obviously we should have been smarter about the regime right from the beginning, when we recognized China in 1970, when it was in the midst of the great proletarian cultural revolution purges. And I think we should have been smarter after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, which made it clear how the regime regarded legitimate protests on the part of the people. But we continued with this myth that, if we were patient enough, that eventually China would not only serve our prosperity, but would become a responsible stakeholder in global relations, and did all sorts of things like military cooperation, for example. But now I think that is clearly, past, and we really have to understand the regime for what it is, look at the at what the leader says in internal documents and statements in Chinese, and stop paying attention to the kind of propaganda that the regime issues towards foreigners through the foreign ministry. So, that's more or less where it is. I don't think we ever got China right, but we're getting it in particularly badly wrong since the past, whatever, decade since Xi Jinping came into power.
Looking at what we're fed through the mainstream media these days, we can see that China has obviously garnered significant economic power. Their military power is building. What other branches of power do you see as the Chinese Communist Party's most effective tool that they've used to garner influence and power internationally?
Well, I think if you look at, say, institutions like the UN, China, through the use of its Belt and Road Initiative funding, has been able to enable corrupt authoritarian dictatorships throughout the world and get them to support China in the UN. So, if we put together a resolution condemning China's genocidal activities towards Turkic Muslims in the Northwest and get, say, 30 some countries to support, China can counter with 80 countries, including Muslim nations, who say that everything China's doing towards its Muslim minority is not genocide, but enormously to their benefit. That kind of nonsense. So, China is able to mobilize these third world countries and get them beholden to China, often through debt trap diplomacy, where China gives a nation enormous loans, knowing full well that the projects that are being supported will not be able to pay back those loans, or they're giving them to regimes where the money will be leaving that country for Swiss bank accounts, and therefore the people will be left holding the bag. And China then asks for concessions. And I think particularly worrying are concessions where China demands long leases on ports. We see this in Sri Lanka. And most disturbingly, most recently, and I think it caused a lot of concern for the United States, and I hope for Canada, is evidence that China is planning to put a port on the Atlantic through Equatorial Guinea. We know they already have an established port in Djibouti, but they would be facing us across the Atlantic from Africa, and that puts, I think, a sort of qualitative change on some matters of strategy in that regard. So, China is able to get these nations to be beholden to China, and using various coordinated means is able to turn them to strategic advantage. So I think that that's a significant factor. Within our own country, it's clear that a lot of people who are influential in the policymaking process towards China appear to be receiving benefits from the Chinese state directly or indirectly, or people who have, politicians who, while in office, have not engaged in supporting policy measures that the People's Republic of China would not like, after retirement, are receiving significant benefits and interesting careers on China-related things through board memberships, law firms, consulting contracts, and so on. So, we do have this issue of whether there are people who, espound positions that support the China's global agenda, including in Canada, who have a conflict of interest, because if they don't say those things, then their income from China will presumably be turned off. So this kind of behavior is really very worrying for us, because we want our policymakers to be making policy in the interests of Canada, and not convinced through a subtle and sophisticated process that plays on their naivety and grave, to be acting consciously or unconsciously as agents for foreign power. So, I think that you get it in advanced countries like Canada, and you're particularly seeing China making enormous inroads into countries in the third world. For example, there's some speculation that the government of Barbados is change in its political structure to remove the Queen as the head of state without a referendum, which could well have failed. That it's not necessarily the case that the people of Barbados wanted to cut that connection, but there's speculation that this is preparatory towards a more China-oriented, Barbados in the Caribbean, and one has seen a lot of investment by China in that tiny country. Just one indicator of a very gradual systemic process where China is consistently gaining benefit and gradually establishing itself as dominant by tipping the balance of power in all sorts of aspects around the world. I think in a lot of ways it resembles a game of Go. It's one tile at a time. I used to play that game in the dormitory with my Chinese roommates, and it takes a long time to play a game of Go. I would be thinking that finally I was getting ahead and would win. And over my 4 years at Fudan University, the total number of times I won at playing Go with the Chinese guys in the dormitory was unfortunately zero. They always eventually beat me without a lot of difficulty because I was maybe just not as engaged as I should have been in that game. And I think that with Canada, we're seeing a sort of comparable process where it's happening one tile at a time, but we don't see the larger picture of when a balance will be tipped.
I mean, we can look south of the border in the U.S. for examples of whether it be elite capture or useful idiots or simply just corporate greed. But focusing on Canada, how do you see these tiles being pulled out from under us? What is the Chinese Communist Party tactic of tipping the balance of power in their favor? You open up any national news broadcaster, and it's not really reported on. There's certain mentions of certain decisions, but I'm wondering if you could explain this for the layman on how this is organized.
Well, I think, of course, one quite striking example has been our apparent reluctance to ban the Huawei 5G. We know from our allies that it's that the Huawei 5G would give at least the capability to the Chinese state to have critical information about infrastructure that could be acted on in times of conflict to cripple our defenses, or that Huawei 5G would facilitate massive downloads of databases, which we've seen in other countries, including the United States, to the Chinese state for very sophisticated analysis, including identifying people that could be targets for elite capture, or people in critical positions that China might want to get over to their side. So, the idea that a firm closely associated with the Chinese military could have the ability to control our telecommunications and a lot of other of this Internet of Things stuff that 5G evidently allows is concerning. And the fact that our government, despite being given ample evidence of this potential and warnings from former heads of security agencies over the years, has still not made a decision on it is puzzling, to say the least. But I think in other areas, China would like to get control of Canadian resources, energy and mining resources, and is prepared to pay a premium price for that. But it also allows, once the Chinese regime, say, gets critical control of certain economic sectors, it then facilitates political coercion by threatening to withdraw funding from those sectors if they're unhappy with political decisions made by the Canadian government. Not to speak of matters like the attempted acquisition by Shandong Gold of a gold mine up in the north that had the potential for allowing for some port facilities out into the Northwest Passage, which might have had some implications for submarine activity, and was also, not that far from a significant NORAD installation. So the gold mine was a money-losing mine. The Chinese state was prepared to offer a price, a high price over premium for the mine. Why would they do that if there weren't other benefits? It's similar to the pricing of the Huawei equipment is very competitive compared to Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. But presumably that's because the Chinese have factored in other beneficial other benefits from installing that equipment that allows them to subsidize it if that's what's going on. Or there was the Aecon construction matter where, a Chinese state firm wanted to acquire Canada's largest privately owned construction company, which was involved in even the Gordie Howe Bridge between Canada and US. The government, to my surprise, did not approve that, but obviously that would have provided Chinese regime with an enormous amount of information that would be of, potentially eventual strategic use to China. And then we see any number of other acquisitions which, are causes of concern. China's attempt to gain monopolies over or close monopolies over certain rare earths through acquisition of Canadian companies, even those that are functioning abroad. And then also the puzzling decision on the part of cabinet to reverse a decision of the previous cabinet at the recommendation of CSIS with regard to the acquisition of a Montreal firm who had technology that had a dual use capability for application to directed energy weaponry. Why, if it was rejected by a previous cabinet, would the matter then be revived under our current government? How is that possible that the decision that was made by a previous government would be reversed? Or other Chinese acquisitions of satellite technology, which, looked as if they would be serving Chinese military purposes because this technology was also used by the US military and the military of the government of Taiwan. So, there are a lot of puzzling things that go on. I think it's part of an overall PRC strategy to just gradually, one by one, gain these advantages, which eventually could be linked together to engage in coercive pressure against our democracy and lead Canada into a position where our sovereignty is being threatened by an asymmetrical relationship with a much larger power that doesn't agree with our democratic process and rule of law. I mean, the last one would have been the Meng case, where the government of China felt if they exerted enough pressure, our government would intervene in a matter which was before our independent judiciary with regard to her eligibility for extradition to the United States. I think China almost achieved that by mobilizing a lot of Canadians who were supporting the Chinese position that the Minister of Justice should stop the consideration of our extradition under BC Superior Court Associate Judge Heather Holmes, and simply direct Justice Holmes to let Ms. Meng return to Beijing. So I mean, it's just one thing after another. It's hard to put your finger on one enormous single incident, but you certainly see a lot of things which put together suggest that Canada should be much more aware of what the Chinese regime is doing and preventing it from doing these things. So far, thank God, we have stopped the acquisition by Shandong Gold, and the acquisition of Aecon was also blocked, but there's still a lot of smaller things lot of things which fall below the threshold for foreign investment review that China is able to engage in, and put several small investments together to come up with one larger benefit for the state. So that, I think that's essentially it. I mean, China just has an enormous amount of funding and large number of personnel who are involved in this kind of work, and Canada simply doesn't have the resources and the expertise to effectively counter a very well organized, well funded, very sophisticated Chinese approach, which takes advantages of the weaknesses in our democratic system.
Mm. I mean, it's tough. You look at a number of books that have come out recently, Hidden Hand, Sam Cooper's recent book, Willful Blindness. I mean, they seem to be more and more by the month are being published. It's not a secret, but the education of the general population just doesn't seem to be there. And yet, you look at policies that are implemented by our allies, Australia, their Foreign Agents Registry Act, anti-corruption legislation being put into place in the U.S. and also in Australia, and a number of other allies, and that's not featuring at all in Ottawa. And I wonder whether it's useful idiots, or if there's a fear of the often the tactic is used to paint any criticism of the PRC as racist or this broad brush. But at what point does this become too late that we look at the recent election and there's obvious cases of foreign influence in that? How are you looking at those issues, and why do you see you can see the occasions of action, but few and far between in comparison with the cases of inaction?
Yeah, I think that you hit on the key point here. Clive Hamilton, as you say in his book Hidden Hand, identifies Canada as having the highest degree of elite capture of all the Western industrialized nations. So, that is a cause for concern. And I think that the justification for making compromises to Chinese pressure is that we should prioritize our prosperity through trade and investment with China in the relations, and the other issues should be subordinated to that. The thing about it is that countries like Australia and New Zealand are much more reliant on trade with China than we are. Australia, we're looking at something like about a third of their external trade, mostly commodities, mining products, goes to China, whereas for Canada, it's less than 5%. But I think that there is a misunderstanding among the population of Canada of the extent to which our exports are dependent on the Chinese market, and the fact that our exports to China are primarily minerals and agricultural commodities for which there is a global market. In other words, if China decided not to buy Canadian canola seeds, there will be other markets that will open up because they'll have to get them from somewhere. So there is this illusion that China is very important to us, and that Canadians will lose their jobs unless we comply with Chinese threats to engage in economic coercion if we don't, send our prime minister to sit in the front row and make nice with the Chinese Politburo during the Olympics, or Lord knows what. The Dalai Lama shouldn't be allowed to come to Canada, or any number of other things, or we shouldn't be running freedom of navigation exercises in the Taiwan Straits, or and so on and so on and so on. China has a lot of things that they don't want Canada to be doing, and would try and menace us with consequences if we do them. So, I think from that point of view, that is an issue for us that we need to make clear, and I think make a stand towards China where we say, well, we're going to do the right thing. And if you are going to engage in economic retaliation, fine, we'll just have to do commensurate measures ourselves. And after all, China has 3 to 1 trade imbalance with Canada. So, they're sending a lot more stuff here than we're sending there. So they would suffer more from economic sanctions. And I think in general, what we've seen with Australia is that the economic sanctions that China imposed on Australia, because Australia demanded that China agree to a neutral international investigation of the origins of the COVID-19, among other things, stopping Australian wines and other commodities from being imported into China. I think some coal was, on spurious grounds, non-tariff barriers were imposed or high taxes were imposed, that Australia was able to successfully transition away from their dependence on the Chinese market to other places, which, I think probably caused a lot of concern in Beijing, because they acted on a threat, and then it doesn't seem to have led to a change in Australia's commitment to continue to stand firm against Chinese malign activities in Australia and the region. So, what we need is for us to look at what Australia is doing, implement a Foreign Agents Registry Act, or as it's called in Australia, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, so that we can clear away this problem of people who are, as you say, useful idiots or naively representing the Chinese regime, who receive benefits from the Chinese state out of our policy process, and look at what sorts of policies will serve Canada's strategic security and sovereignty interests in the years ahead. But there's a lot of resistance to the idea of having such an act. I think Senator Yuan Pao Wu has put a statement on his website in which he gives, I think, essentially 3 reasons why we shouldn't have the act, if I remember correctly. The first being that, this sort of elite capture may be going on in Australia, but it's not happening in Canada. The second being that we don't need such an act because our security agencies are already fully able to address such issues. And thirdly, that such an act could violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And there's other indications that these acts would unfairly target persons of Chinese origin. But when the act came in Australia, the Australian former Minister of International Trade, who negotiated the free trade agreement between Australia and China, the same agreement that China was hoping Canada would essentially cut and paste for the Canada-China free trade agreement, but we decided not to, because our justice people determined that agreement was too favorable to the Chinese side. The former Minister of International Trade, Mr. Robb, was found to be in receipt of an $800,000 annual private consultancy with a Chinese billionaire who had negotiated a 99-year lease on the port of Darwin. Well, there's nothing illegal in this. Obviously, Mr. Robb must be like a wonderful consultant to get $800,000 a year for a part-time job, but he subsequently, just before the act came into effect, resigned that consultancy. So one might expect in Canada some sort of comparable response if, in fact, we had such an act. But in reference to the matter of electoral interference in the last election, it is true that just at the time when the polling was looking like the Conservative Party, which had a very strong China program in their party platform for the election, just when it looked as if the Conservative Party might achieve a minority government in Canada, all of a sudden on WeChat, there was very strong disinformation that a private member's bill proposing a Foreign Agents Registry Act that had gone through first reading some months before and would never have come to pass, would require all persons of Chinese origin to essentially register with the state and report any activities relating to Chinese groups. Well, this was completely false information. The purpose of the act was simply to require transparency from people who were receiving benefits from the Chinese state. But, this was very effective disinformation. The sponsor of the private member bill, Kenny Chiu, attempted to counter it through Mandarin interviews in Vancouver, and the mainstream English media also reported on this. Elections Canada refused to intervene on the basis that this was national security matter, and they would collaborate with other agencies to address this matter. And the result was that Mr. Chiu's internal polling immediately started to plummet when the disinformation came out. And we believe that this disinformation scheme resulted in the loss of seats of 3 members of parliament who were in the Conservative Party in ridings where there were strong ethnic Chinese populations. I was asked to look over this material, really in the absence of, effective Canadian government ability to do this. And, I found that it was impossible to identify the author of the material, which was repeated on many Chinese websites, mostly in simplified characters on the internet, and impossible to identify the websites that were reproducing this material with any institutions. I couldn't find any linguistic parallels to writings that had been issued in the mainland. So in other words, it didn't look as if it had been cut and paste from sources in Beijing. So we have no hard evidence that the disinformation came out from a foreign power. But the fact of the timing of it, and the nature of it being in simplified characters to send over WeChat, which a lot of Canadians of Chinese origin use, does make it very suspicious. But up to now, I hope I'm wrong, but my understanding is that CSIS doesn't have the capacity to really deal with this matter and prevent this disinformation from occurring in the next election. If there are no consequences for the sources of this disinformation, presumably they will be emboldened to do more of it next time. And I think it's possible that for the Conservative Party, which similarly had no capacity to address this foreign language material, the lesson might be, if you put information in, if you have a strong stance on China's malign influence inside Canada, including, Chinese state harassment of persons in our country who are seen as, critical to China forwarding its agenda, like Canadian Tibetans or Canadian Uyghurs or democracy activists and so on. If you put that into your electoral program, you lose seats. So the Chinese may in fact have won on this one, and next election we won't see a strong conservative platform suggesting that the government, if comes to power, will seriously address the issue of the Chinese threat to our sovereignty and security, because politically it's seen as working against the interests of the party to be reelected. And that's their primary concern, is to get into power and deal with domestic issues. And the China one could just be, as it has been for decades, set aside and left for others to address. So sorry to produce such a downer commentary on your question, but the situation is, pretty bad.
Yeah. Before we close out, we're going into year 2+ of the pandemic, and you brought up that Australia requested a more in-depth look at this, and yet we see nothing about this in the mainstream press. And since the pandemic, we've also seen a massive increase in what appears to be the Chinese Communist Party belligerence and massive mobilizations. Am I reading this right? Has this been completely shuffled to the side, and are we looking at a further belligerent PRC, or is this how are you seeing this?
Well, I think that there has been concern about lawfare if media produce articles which show the Chinese regime in an unfavorable light. or identify people that are seen as having contacts with the Chinese state, which doesn't seem to be consistent with their role as Canadian representatives in parliaments. So, I mean, I think that does have some constraining effect, but I think our media in general has been pretty good on China. I myself continue to be published in pretty much all of the Canadian national newspapers with commentary on China that I'm sure the Chinese embassy is not happy about. We do have quite a cohort of reporters, Bob Fife and Steve Chase, or Terry Glavin, Jeremy Nuttall, Joanna Chiu, Tom Blackwell, and so on, who continue to put out the word. But I think that for Canadians in general, this matter just doesn't have enough presence to affect their electoral choices. So while you do see polling, which suggests that most Canadians get it, that 85% of us feel that our government's policy towards China is not acknowledging the nature of the threat to Canadian security and sovereignty. When it comes down to elections, the China issue is hardly raised, despite the Conservative Party having a lot of it in their platform. We didn't hear it coming up in the debates, except one question in the French debate that really was sort of biased against challenging China. So I think that there's still a notion among Canadians that this is something which is far away from Canadian realities, and a reluctance to identify the China threat as real. In other words, we tend to be a trusting people of goodwill and expect that the Chinese regime is similarly amenable to being reasonable and collaborative with us and to speak the truth. I mean, certainly the hostage diplomacy incident with Kovrikin's favor, I think, has had some resonance, but now Mr. Kovrikin's favor are safely back in Canada. Will we decide that we can put that all behind us as an anomaly and carry on with relations as they were before 2018 and continue to engage with the Chinese regime on Chinese terms? Or do we decide that we really need to tighten up and engage in some kind of retaliation over what happened to these two men in the interests of maintaining the integrity of our country and our commitment to the international rule of law? So that I think that is a concern for the future, is how do you get people to actively engage? I don't think that the fomenting of anti-Asian hatred seems to be mostly on the Chinese side, hoping to induce persons of Chinese origin to identify with the Chinese regime and to support that regime, possibly through collaborating in espionage or other purposes, and to make people of Chinese origin in Canada feel that they are not Canadian. Well, that's a very disturbing trend, because of course we would like Canadians of Chinese origin to fully participate in our democracy and support the purposes of the country that they have chosen to become citizens of, and not to continue to identify with the country that they decided to leave. In other words, it's really better if we have loyalties to our country of citizenship and simply celebrate the culture of the country that we came from, but not attempt to enable the interests of that country in Canada. So, we have a lot to deal with here, and I don't think that we're putting enough resources and effort into addressing it. And the Chinese regime is happy to see that and hopes that we will continue to allow them to function in our country more or less unfettered.
Those are really good points, and probably a great place to end our talk today. Before I do, though, what would you say your number one recommendation for a book would be on Chinese foreign influence abroad, and what would your other book recommendation be on defining what threat the People's Republic of China faces to the world?
Well, I think, certainly the book that you referenced, Clive Hamilton and Marika Olberg's Hidden Hand, is very good. Clive Hamilton's earlier book, Silent Invasion, talks about Australia, but I think that, the idea that China is not doing things in Canada that they're doing in Australia seems unlikely to me. I think there's also a lot of work by Anne-Marie Brady on Chinese malevolent activities. Josh Rogan of the Washington Post has produced a number of good writings and a recent book that I think deserves us to look at. And we're also seeing domestically people like Stephanie Carvin, who are putting into the public domain a lot of stuff that previously I think was known to a smaller group of us who are more sensitized to these issues. So there's a lot of stuff out there. I wish that we had more on Canada, beyond the kind of studies we've seen up to now. The Claws of the Panda is very good, but it's not completely focused on Chinese malign activities in our country through the United Front Work Department or the elite chapter capture activities of the regime. And I think that we need more very specific studies that would make it crystal clear to Canadians what's going on. And let's hope that we'll see those in the years ahead.
Definitely. And where's the best place to follow you, Dr. Burton?
I have Facebook. I have Twitter. I think that probably would work. My Twitter handle is cburton001, and my Facebook, I think, is pretty easily found. I have 2 pages actually. My fan page contains really my own writings more or less exclusively. I think that's cburton001. Then I have another one, chas.burton, which also contains recommendations of other writings that I think people should read. But I have, I'm not sure how many followers I have, a few thousand followers. Let's keep it real. It compares with several million followers by the likes of people like Justin Bieber. So, I'm not sure.
Quality, not quantity.
How much my social media impact is overall.
Well, maybe we can get you a Timbit line as well. All right, Dr. Burton, thank you so much. That was a great talk.
Great to talk with you.